Hi and welcome to this video tutorial. My name is Ron Vellon, and in this video we're going to be exploring what power looks like in a negotiation, the different kinds of power you can have, and how to work with it, both when you have power in the negotiation and when you have an opponent who may have more power than you. We're also going to have a brief discussion about persuasion and how to influence the negotiation even when there's a power imbalance. So let's begin. When we look at power in general, but specifically in a negotiation, we're looking at four main sources. And these are organizational sources of power essentially, but we see them in real life in different contexts. And of course, in this case, we're talking about a negotiation setting. What are the four? We've got informational sources of power, power based on position in an organization, relationship-based sources of power, and something called contextual sources of power. So let's look at the first one, informational sources of power. This is typically the most common form, and it shows up in two main ways. It's first of all derived from how well a negotiator can assemble and organize data to support the position or the argument or whatever the outcome is. So it could be simply having the information and talking about it, and how it's presented. So if you can present a really well-informed circumstance and have great information and data to support it, that will help better support your position in the negotiation. The other way it shows up is in the specific expertise or knowledge you may have or have access to that gives you power. So if you have your own expertise, that gives you power in a specific sense, that you have some information or knowledge that your opponent might not have. It may not be yours, but maybe you have access, or you have some kind of proprietary ownership or exclusivity that no one else can access this particular information, or it's rare because of this exclusivity that you have or proprietary ownership over it. So once again, you can either have well-presented information in your negotiation that gives you a little more power, that's really in the power of communicating that information, and or you can have your own deep expertise, whether you present it or not. Maybe you have it by reputation and that helps you, and you can just call it up at a moment's notice. Or you have access to something that not everyone does, or it's some kind of proprietary ownership. This gives power in the form of information. And depending on what you're negotiating about, it might help. So, for example, if you're negotiating on something, let's say you're working on an environmental agreement and you're working for a large company that wants to tap into a water source, maybe you have exclusive data that you've researched or your company has done some research on that shows water table levels for the last 20 years, and you use that data to support your cause about having access so you can bottle the water. Your opposition might not have that access, or maybe their data is different. And so each of you will have your own informational power that you're going to use to make your point or to support your position. So that's informational sources of power. Next is power based on your position in an organization. And this too comes in two flavors, I like to call it. There are two sources. One is the legitimate power that comes with your role in the organization. So it's your role or your title. And if you've ever taken a course in organizational behavior or dynamics, this is a term that's used to describe somebody whose title gives them legitimate power. It's the hierarchy that blesses you with a particular power of the position. The other form of power that may or may not be related to the actual title you have is the power you have over the control of resources. And anybody who has been in a situation where they've had a title that seemed important, but they actually didn't have a lot of budget or maybe a lot of access to resources, can sometimes be frustrated because they typically have to ask other people who have resources and money available to do things. In a negotiation, if you have power over resources, and this may have nothing to do with being in an organization, but maybe you work for some body and you have access to funding for a particular kind of initiative and you're negotiating with a private company to perform a certain amount of work for you, you have access to the resources, the money to pay them, and they want to do the work. So you have a little bit of control because you have the budget. If you have the authority as well, then that gives you a lot of power in the negotiation. Sometimes what happens is people with less actual legitimate power in an organization are given a budget to work with under certain parameters, so they might not have the authority to go beyond those parameters if a project or something changes. They might need to go back to their legitimate power, the people that gave them or blessed them with that money or that budget, to ask for permission. And so if you're ever working in a negotiation situation with somebody who might be in a junior or mid-level role who's acting on behalf of another department and they are given a certain amount of control over the budget, you may eventually have to negotiate with their boss or the people that they're accountable to. So those are the two major sources of power in an organization. One last thing I'll mention about this is within an organizational setting, it is often the case that what we call service or support departments, human resources, accounting, legal, other things that might be more of a support to the organization. Sometimes we have environmental stewardship and things like that. Often they don't have the budgets that the operating departments like sales, marketing, and other things have. So what sometimes happens is you might have some kind of legitimate power in terms of your role, your title, but you might need the money from somebody else. So in that case, your legitimate power will be paired, or you'll have to work with somebody who has the resource control. So this is where it gets interesting. So if you ever find yourself in a negotiation with an organization or a company you want to do work with, make sure you understand what the reporting structures are, how much authority your opponent has. Really important to understand that, so that in case you need to go further, that you understand that there may be other people you need to convince or negotiate with as a part of that agreement. And finally, to complete the conversation about resource-based power, what are those resources? Things you're, I'm sure, very familiar with. Money, of course, is the big one. Maybe it's supplies, access to things you might need simply to do your department's job on a day-to-day basis. Human capital, which is kind of an inhuman way of saying people. People do cost money in organizations, so having access to people perhaps in other departments, borrowing people for projects, that kind of thing, that all has to be allocated and somebody has to accept the cost for that. Time. Time and money are often equated. They're not the same, but in the business world, certainly time is something that's tracked and has a monetary value in many cases. Equipment use. The cost of equipment. If you have equipment other people need, gives you a certain amount of power, and vice versa. Somebody else has equipment you need. At the same time, if you need to go out and lease things as an option, maybe your BATNA in a negotiation is to lease equipment or buy it, that may not be an ideal alternative. Next is critical services. That can be anything from warranty service, repair, upkeep, installation, this kind of thing. These are the fundamental services that might support something that you're negotiating for. So let's say it's a purchase of something, a large piece of equipment, and there are all these critical services to support it. These are things you'll be negotiating for. And the last one may not be seen as a power resource the way the others are, because it is so available. But this is all about the support you can provide if you're the person with the availability of it to give to somebody who's working on something or doing something for you. This is anything from a pat on the back, emotional support, somebody being available just to listen, provide an alternative context, provide mentorship perhaps. Again, this is the kind of thing you would probably see mostly within an organization if you're negotiating in that context. The next one we're looking at is the power based on networks. Again, this is an organizational setting, source of power, and it's not about formal authority. It's not about your position. This is all about your relationships, or what we've referred to as relationship sources of power. This is an answer to the question, who do I know? and what is my relationship with them in the context of whatever I'm working on negotiating. So having a strong, powerful network can really help you in a negotiation. That's one part. The other part of this network idea comes from your access. So when you have formal authority within an organization, we talked about resource control. You might not have resource control. You might not have the authority to govern who gets what resource or allocation. In other words, you don't have the authority formally over it. But this kind of network power comes from where you might be a linchpin or a connector to things like money or other resources in the organization. So maybe you work in a department that has a lot of funding, and maybe you have the power to influence someone who does have the authority. Or maybe you're the one that distributes funding. Even though you don't have the authority, you're the one who enacts it. And maybe you're the one that sits in all those decision-making meetings, and the people you're connected to are making final decisions, but you're throwing in your own opinion, your own perspective. And this happens quite often in organizations with people's support staff. I've always maintained that we need to speak to the people that are the assistants and support people to the decision makers as much as those decision makers, because they're the ones that say, hey, this is a project worthwhile, you should consider this. They're the ones that will put in a good word for you in an organization. So don't underestimate the power of people with great networks, even if they don't have the formal authority, but they'll be able to connect you to it. Really, really valuable. The next category or sources of power is called contextual. And what are contextual sources of power? This is power that's based on the context or situation or environment in which negotiations take place. The first contextual source, and often the most powerful depending on what it is your BATNA. So this is the best alternative to your negotiated agreement. The key here is alternative. What happens if your negotiation falls apart or does not reach a good agreement? So it's your alternative that gives you a lot of power, because if you have a really strong alternative, you know that you don't desperately need this deal. If you want it because it's a better solution, and it would be if you're negotiating, then your alternative, that's one thing. But if you're kind of held hostage to it because you don't have any other option, then you don't have a lot of power. And even though you can try to fake it and pretend and all that, it kind of oozes out of our pores in the form of a little bit of insecurity or doubt that may or may not come up. So having a great BATNA is super helpful. I always tell people a BATNA is not a wish. It's not a possible option. It needs to be concrete to have its power. So make sure that it's real and tangible, meaning it actually could be chosen tomorrow, because if it doesn't exist in this way, it won't have its level of power for you. So if you're looking for a job, very simple example, and you're in an interview, it's much better for you if you've already interviewed or you've already applied somewhere else and heard some feedback that they like you and want to potentially hire you. That's why we always say, if you're looking for a great job or a new position, interview in 2 or 3 places. Even if the other 2 places you're not really that crazy about, interview there first if you can, and then have that in your back pocket, have those options available when you go in for your first choice. Makes a huge difference. The other context or contextual source of power is culture. If you are working in an environment, let's say, that is new to you, let's say you travel to a country and a culture that's quite different from yours, there are certain rules and practices that you may not be completely familiar with, and typically are not completely familiar with unless you've had a lot of practice. And there may be little hidden clues and things going on that you will not notice, because they are things that are really embedded in that culture. So the more different a culture is from your own, the more hidden things are going to be going on that you may miss, that may affect the outcome of that negotiation. This also applies to organizational cultures, team cultures, and things like that. So it can be national, so nations, organizations, teams. And we need to think of it this way. How do we notice different things in cultures? Well, there are norms of behavior that we can pay attention to. So you may be negotiating with somebody in a different company or a different part of the company that you're in, and their way of doing things is a little bit different. There'll be less differences than if you're going company to company or city to city or nation to nation. But it's really important to be as informed as you can be about how things are being done. The last part here about agents, constituencies, and external audiences. This is about possibly employing or working with external forces that might help influence a negotiation. Kind of an informal network that you might be able to tap into or employ even to help move a negotiation along. This becomes an important factor if you're dealing with significant cultural differences, not just language, but also customs and ways of doing things, and perhaps even geographic distance. All of these things, especially external audiences, maybe it's the media that's observing your negotiation or interested parties, they can make the negotiation more complex, and with the right agents and constituencies might be able to facilitate an agreement that might not have otherwise come so easily without that support. So now we're going to look at what we do when we're negotiating with other people who have more power than we do. How do we handle it? Well, there are a number of things we can do, and where the imbalance of power comes from is not as important right now in terms of this conversation, but the context and what's going on, where the power source is, may affect which of these approaches you take. The first one, never do an all or nothing deal. This is a situation where you have kind of a make or break deal set up that if it doesn't go through, you end up with nothing. This favors the higher power party because they have alternatives. BATNAs, they might be just bigger entities. For example, if you're a small business and you want to sell into a large company like, let's say, Walmart or Costco or something, well, they have thousands of products and suppliers, and you're just one small fish in this pond. They can dispose of you and find someone to replace you in a moment's notice. You, however, might be relying on this whole situation to make or break your business. So if you don't get the complete deal you want, take what you can get out of the negotiation without sacrificing everything or putting everything on the line. Really important. So this is a precaution as you're going into a negotiation with someone who has more power than you, especially a much bigger entity. Make the other party smaller. Well, you can't physically change them into a smaller party. This is what it means. When you're dealing with a larger party, a bigger organization or a bigger team or a more powerful entity, you want to establish relationships with more than one person. So this is about establishing multiple relationships. So if you become well networked with your opponent's organization that you're working with, maybe you know people in the organization or you know different people in the opponent party where you have those personal relationships built up, that is what's meant by making the other party smaller. All of a sudden you have multiple smaller parties kind of as subgroups of this larger entity that you're working with. And by contrast, making yourself bigger is about going into a negotiation with a coalition of other small parties to help increase your power in the negotiation. Certainly we've seen this with unions where multiple employees get together and form a union and they can negotiate together. We've seen this happen with multiple suppliers, small businesses form a coalition to negotiate with a large buyer, things like that, where you have common interests and you can benefit from a shared negotiation. So that's the other thing, that this becomes a shared negotiation process where the multiple parties are involved, or you have one group or one party involved and it's setting a standard that the other parties will benefit from. There was an interesting talk I was listening to from Malcolm Gladwell, who talked about the evolution of the big league sports contracts starting with baseball in the mid-70s, 1970s. And as a result of free agency that was eventually established, people started to see from other professions that they could get great contracts as well as more independent talent across different businesses, not just sports. And so by forming a bit of a coalition, in other words, working with the union of baseball players and getting new deals for them, that had a big ripple effect across other industries. The next one is building momentum through doing deals in sequence. And that simply means doing one deal, then another, and you start to develop a rapport and a rhythm working with your opponent that slowly reduces the impact of the opponent's power that has a more dominating effect normally in that negotiation. Typically, this shows up as smaller deals initially, and then you start to get into bigger deals afterwards. And so by developing this momentum with smaller agreements, you start to develop trust, you start to develop a working relationship, and the power is less of a factor. And in fact, the larger power entity, your opponent, may see it as being benevolent or supportive because you start to develop that personal relationship. Use the power of competition to leverage power. What does this mean? This is essentially about creating BATNAs. So not only are you offering your service, product, whatever it is, to your one opponent or your one potential customer, if it's a sales situation, you're actually getting out there and creating multiple opportunities. So now you're creating BATNAs, you're actually creating internal competition in your own mind that you have these options. And it may also be able to be communicated in one way or another, maybe not directly, but maybe your opponent finds out that they're not the only ones wanting your product or service or whatever it is that's on the table. Constraining yourself. This essentially is about tying your own hands. And what do we mean by this? When you're working with another entity that's more powerful than you, an opponent, another company, whatever the circumstance might be, you can create an agreement that is kind of like a shared limitation. So you might put in a restriction on who you're allowed to do business with while you're working with them. Maybe it's a competition factor or whatever it is, but they in turn will restrict who they're allowed to buy from. And together you kind of put yourself in a lockstep that restricts both competition for you and your position within the negotiation and ultimately the working agreement, and also restricts the company from doing it, but it also may constrain you later on, maybe if you want to expand. So you have to be careful how you do this. It doesn't always work very well, especially if you want to have other opportunities, because if you get locked into one major player and it doesn't work out or something goes wrong, you may get stuck by not having other options available. The next one, good information is always a source of power. This is really about having information power, as we've discussed earlier. So this is about cultivating great information even while the negotiation is ongoing. If it's a fairly lengthy process, get information and develop that power as you go along. Do what you can to manage the process. This is simply about making an effort to influence the negotiation process. Whatever you can do, whatever terms or circumstances you can create to help the process work in a way that supports you in one way or another, maybe having a time of day or location or people there, whatever it is that might help you, because if nothing else works, at least you'll have some parts of the process you might be able to handle. It's rare for an opponent with more power to dictate everything in a negotiation and just walk away, because in the end they know it might result with you reneging on the deal or something going wrong. And now we're going to take a quick look at a couple of things to keep in mind to help with persuasion during a negotiation. It's not all about having power. In other words, you don't have to have lots of power to be persuasive. And there are techniques that you as a negotiator can use to influence your opponent's attitude and their behavior. We're not going into that in depth now in this video, But here are a couple of things to keep in mind as you move forward with any negotiation. There are two main routes to persuading or influencing your opponent. The first is the central route. This is all about making your case. So these are the arguments for your position. This is about convincing the others to give you what you want. This is about basically building up the logical argument for what you want. The peripheral route is about the emotions. This is about the emotions, about feelings, about understanding, about attitude. A lot of what we talk about when we explore things like tactical empathy, mirroring, labeling, things like that we're learning in other aspects of our course, this is where it comes out. This is the peripheral route. This is where we explore the connectivity in the relationship. This is where the emotional and need elements of interests comes into play. So that's why we're not discussing it at length here. The last thing, though, I would like to discuss with you are just some key elements of when we are taking the central route, when we are making the case for our position. There are certain things that come down to good communication, which you've probably learned in other situations, other capacities, in an OB course, other communication courses. So these are three things just to keep in mind when you are communicating what you're looking for and what your perspectives are. The first is the content of the message. Of course, you want to make sure that your facts and topics are clear, your information is clear, it's well presented. Really important that the content is what you want it to be. This can be anything from simply communicating it verbally, making sure the information is accurate and clean, and anything you present visually. So make sure your content is bang on and you know what you're talking about. The next one is the structure of the message. This is about the arrangement and organization of the topics and content you want to discuss. And so you want to make sure you think it through. If you have to present something fairly complex, especially things like that, you want to make sure it follows a simple logic that anybody can follow. You want to keep it clear. You want to keep it simple. That doesn't mean being simplistic. You certainly don't want to leave things out, but this is about clear, good structure. And the last one is delivery style. And this is going to vary depending on what you need to do in the moment. But if you're talking about prepared information, I'm not talking about reading stuff, but if you're preparing something in advance for a negotiation around content which you need to think about, you want to make sure you understand what your position actually is, and that when you deliver it, you're relaxed to make sure, though, that your delivery style matches the message you're trying to convey. So we'll wrap up here. This really is a focus on the power dynamics within a negotiation. And I wish you well as you negotiate with the understanding of how to work with power, both when you have it and when you don't have it.